My name is James Finley, and I live in Marina del Rey, California.
And you're very lucky.
I am lucky. Ocean's right outside the window.
Yes. So I want to just start with a simple question to get down the basic demographics. Where are the different places you've lived in your life? And tell me about your schooling.
That'd be good. I was born and raised in Akron, Ohio. And when I graduated from high school in 1961, I left my home and entered the cloistered Trappist monastery of the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky. And I lived there as a member of the community for almost 6 years. When I left the monastery, I returned back to my home in Akron, and I got married, have 2 children by that marriage, and moved to Cleveland, Ohio, about 50 miles north of Akron. And I taught at St. Ignatius High School, an all-boys Jesuit prep school in Cleveland. I taught religion there with a colleague of mine, and we wrote high school religion textbooks that were used around the country. Jesus in You, Your Faith in You, Morality in You, as a series. And so then when I was living there and teaching high school and writing the textbooks, I felt called to write my book, Merton's Palace of Nowhere. In Merton's Palace of Nowhere, when I was at the monastery studying under Thomas Merton as novice master, I learned at the very heart of his teachings was the notion of the true self, which is ultimate identity. So the spiritual life is the path in which we're healed from what hinders us from experientially living in our ultimate identity of who God eternally knows us to be, hidden with Christ and God before the origins of the universe. How do we find that? So when that book came out, I started getting invitations to give silent contemplative retreats around the United States and Canada. And one of the first people that invited me was a clinical psychologist, John Finch, in Seattle, Washington. And he invited me to come he liked Merton's Palace of Nowhere a lot. And he was, his parents were ministers, I think Baptist, evangelical ministers in India. And he himself was evangelical Christian, John Finch was. But he used to sit and listen to the talks of the yogis in the ashram. And he was so touched by the depth of their speaking. So when he read Merton's Palace of Nowhere, it was the first time he was exposed to mystical Christianity like this. And so when I was done giving the retreat, he said to me, he said, if you'd be willing to commit yourself to the contribution of mystical union, to the science of psychology, I'll see to it that you can have a Ph.D. in clinical psychology as a gift with family support, not alone, just an outright gift. And so I accepted the offer. And so I moved with my wife and 2 children to Pasadena, California. And for 6 years, it was a full-time doctoral work living in Pasadena, California, where I became a clinical psychologist. And while there and ending my 5-year term there, my marriage ended. And I was still giving retreats. And that's when I met Maureen, who had already been living here. And so I settled here, and my daughters have here. So that's the story of where I presently at Marina del Rey. Yeah, for me, what it was is I was the oldest of 6 children, and my father was a violent alcoholic, and my mother was a devout Catholic. And a lot of their arguments were about Catholicism, about religion, and so on. But I could tell, even as a child, that her faith sustained her this way. And when she would take us to Mass on Sunday, and she would say, to pray to God to give us the strength to get through the things that happen when Daddy gets mad. That's how she puts it to me. And so I did that. So one of my earliest memories is I'm in my bed at night, alone in the dark, and I'm listening to my father right outside the door yelling at my mother, drunk. And I can remember being very sad because maybe earlier that day he yelled at me or hit me. And I also knew if tomorrow he wanted to do it again, he would, and no one would stop him. And so I prayed the way frightened children pray. And my experience is that God heard my prayer, came to me in the dark and merged with me in a moment I don't remember. That was my first feel like unitive experience, God merging with me. So when I woke up the next morning, the violence still went on when I went outside the door, but it was very different for me, because when I went outside the door, when my father thought he was yelling at me, he was really yelling at that little boy that people could see. He didn't know the real me was taken by God into a secret place inside of God, see, where he could never find me this way. And that experience was a very profound experience for me. I remember also in the Catholic tradition making my first communion when I was 7 years old in the second grade, and believing that the real presence in the Eucharist, that Jesus is actually present in the Eucharist. And I would go with my mother up to the communion rail and receive the host. And I would come back and put the kneeler down, 7 years old. And I'd close my eyes and put my face in my hands and hold real, real still. And because I was inside the church, I sensed that I was inside of God. And because I had just received the Eucharist, I was inside of God who was inside of me. And I held real, real still. And I felt I was at the gate of heaven. So those moments were very foundational to me about reality, like that inner world, that divine, interiorly realized world was much more reliable and realistic than this outer world, which is very scary and confusing because of the violence. It didn't make any sense to me this way. And so that was my first, I say that's how the momentum got going until I first discovered Thomas Merton's writings. I had permission to spend several hours a day in the loft of an abandoned sheep barn. It was on the grounds of the monastery. And I remember once I was in the loft of this barn. The loft doors were always left wide open. And there was woods right there. It went up on a hill up to where Thomas Merton's Hermitage was. And off to the side was a meadow. And I would put a bale of straw at an angle there, and I would sit there and look out at that meadow. And it was very hot, Kentucky in the summer. I remember it was real hot. And I was walking back and forth. I was reading the Psalms back and forth. And all of a sudden, there was this vivid realization that what we tend to think of as the air is God. And I was literally walking back and forth in God, breathing God. And I also had this sense that if I would try to flee from God, I'd be running from God in God. And wherever I ended up, God would be waiting for me when I got there. Also with it was this deep feeling there was no need to run at all, because the intimacy was that God knew me, like through and through and through and through and through is mercy, like an oceanic mercy this way, compassion this way. And I sat on that bale of straw, just taken up by that. And when I heard the bell ring for vespers, to chant vespers, I walked over for vespers. I chanted vespers, breathing God. I ate my supper that night, breathing God. I went to bed that fell asleep, breathing God. I walked around like that for 3 days. And on Sunday, I was walking this place I used to go in the woods there in Kentucky. They have a lot of farmland and so on. And I was walking in the woods, and it was a little wooded path going up a hill toward this little lake that I used to go sit at. And there were trees along either side of that little thing, like overarching overhead, like a canopy. And I was walking up this little path, breathing God, and I reached out and touched one leaf of that tree. And it suddenly dawned on me that the infinite presence of God was presencing itself as the presence of the tree, presencing itself at my touching the presence of the tree. And it was so radicalized for me. I walked off to the side of the road, to the thing, into this big meadow, and the tall grass was very windy. I sat there all afternoon that way. It changed my life, really. Yes. I went to Merton I would see him every other week for one-on-one spiritual direction. And I told him about these experiences. And he said to me, he said, once in a while, you'll find somebody with whom you can speak about such things, but they're hard to find. And he said, a lot of people don't even know they are real. Some people, they know they're real, but you can do it later if you want to. And he said, that's your solitude. He said, once in a while, you'll find somebody. And he had to know that he was the one that I could find. He had to know that. He said, but you'll spend most of your life without such a person. But you always have your prayer, and you always have the scriptures, and you always have life, and you always have God, and you always have this way, and you walk your walk. So I went to Merton for spiritual direction, but also once a week you would go to confession to receive the sacrament of confession. So you would kneel at a little kneeler, and the priest who's going to hear your confession would sit on a chair on the other side of this grill, and then you use it for spiritual direction. So you could talk one-on-one about prayer, about whatever. So this priest who was hearing my confession, he was just seen as a model monk, and he was very bright. It was just so clear and helpful to me this way. And he sexually abused me. And I had a breakdown. I had a breakdown because I didn't think it was possible. I thought it was safe. I left my home to be this safe place. And then in the midst of the refuge wasn't safe this way. And I just sensed if I didn't leave, I was going to have a breakdown. I was going to have because of the past history of trauma, too, I thought I could have a psychotic break. And so I left. And so when I returned to my home in Akron, 3 of my brothers were in the Vietnam War. They were in the military. My sister in high school, was married. And I just dropped out of the church. I dropped out of the church. I would go with my mother, to Mass on Sunday, but I couldn't see how God could buy into an outfit like this. It seemed so hypocritical to me, and also so patriarchal and so hierarchical, and so like, what's the deal like this? And so what I did was, I got married. First woman I ever dated, who wasn't Christian, wasn't religious at all. I didn't care, and I just wanted an ideal marriage. I wanted to have like an ideal marriage with children. We all loved each other. I had this poetic image in my mind. And she wasn't religious at all. But I still wanted this contact with God. So I would get up early in the morning, and I would sit on the floor in the living room and light a candle. And what I did is Merton introduced me to Buddhism. Thich Nhat Hanh came to the monastery to visit him. And he introduced me to mystical Judaism. Abraham Joshua Heschel came to visit him. A yogi came from India to found an ashram. And Merton practiced yoga, and namaste, the deep yoga, this way. So I started reading the sutras this way and just sitting. And then what I decided to do was to read Thomas Merton like I would read a sutra this way. So I'll say one sentence by Merton. This is a prayer to God. You said, oh, how far I have to go to find you in whom I've already arrived. I only wished it were over. I only wished it were begun. And I found my way back into mystical Catholicism, the ecclesia, this way. And so I emerged back into this, and I brought these other lineages in with me. And so that was my life. I just saw it as daily life, like the depth dimension of daily living. And then when I became a therapist and sat with people in therapy, I worked mainly with trauma survivors who wanted their faith to be a resource in their healing. So I sat all day long where the places for trauma and transcendence touch each other this way. It's the essence of life itself. Where does birth and death and darkness and light, like the alchemy of the intermingling, and how can we find our way to that and live by it this way? So that's, for me, has been a sense of faith, I guess.
So in that time period after the monastery, before you came back to Catholicism through mystical thought, you would say you left your beliefs behind, but your faith not?
I would say, what complicates the story here, actually, is because I was so severely traumatized from when I was age 3 on up to the time I went to the monastery. I went to the monastery traumatized, and I didn't know I was traumatized because I had dissociated. I had a severe dissociative disorder. I dissociated it all. And so when I left the monastery, I was still dissociative. And when I got married, I was dissociative. In other words, when what's happening is too painful to be true, but it's true. And if you're a child, you can't leave. So you have to find a way to leave inside. So I found a way to distance myself from the immediacy of experience. And I kind of lived in this dissociative place. So I would say during the marriage, when I first got married, when Kelly and Amy were little, I think I was just in a very dissociative place. Yeah, it's hard to explain. I didn't ever deny my faith, whatever, but it was kind of like atmospherically ambivalent to me. And yet at the same time had a certain crystalline immediacy to it. So when I started writing Merton's Palace of Nowhere, it took 5 years to write it. I could see when I was writing, it was like a touch point, like a light shining through the dissociation, like the truth of it this way. And it wasn't until years later, uh, when I was offered my doctorate in clinical psychology, and for 5 years, and in order to get your doctorate, you had to go into therapy. I didn't think I needed therapy. I was fine. And when I went into therapy, like all hell, I still didn't think I needed therapy. And what happened really, when I met with Maureen, we were living together. We weren't married yet. And she was very big in AA. She gave me permission to disclose her anonymity. And she said that it would just be the saddest thing in the world, she said, if anything ever happened to us. But she said to me, she said, it's like you're living way back in a cave somewhere and have to go back in there over and over again to bring you out. And she said, I won't do it. She said, if you don't get help with your trauma, I won't let you see me anymore. I won't. It saved my life. Rigorous honesty. And I went into 5 years of intensive, like waking up in my sleep crying and just going through the trauma work this way. And so that's where I saw that when I was a child, I had this experience of God taking me to a secret place. I was really dissociating. And it means I borrowed the religious imagery of my mother to give meaning to dissociating. And I think it's true. But that doesn't mean that God didn't merge with me. God finds us where we are in the midst of confusion. But I had to grow into integrating that secret place inside of me, not as a place to hide in dissociation, but as a ground out of face life on life's terms, as they say in AA. That's been a big part of my journey too, I guess. She was in in-house hospice. She died right here in the living room. Her ashes are right there on the table. I write next to her ashes every morning. And I watched her, and I put this in the memoir, is I was sitting on the edge of her bed. She was having labored breathing. I could tell she was very close to dying. And it was late at night. And I told her, and I think she could hear me intuitively. I told her, I said, sitting with you here like this as you're dying, it reminds me that when I was in the monastery, 18 years old, an old lay brother died. And I remember it was the first time I saw a dead person ever. And so Thomas Merton spoke to the novices about death. He said, it's very helpful to realize that when we die, we don't go anywhere when we die. We don't orbit the earth a few times and go to some far off place. Scripture says, in God we live and move and have our being. We're living our life in the vast interiority of God. All the angels are here, the saints are here, all the dead, because everyone's eternal. Nobody dies. So in ego consciousness, we don't see that. See? But in deep meditative states, you can see the dead. That is, you can interiorly sense their deathless presence of the communion of saints. And I said, that's how I feel with you this way. And I watched her as she breathed her. I realized that death isn't an event, it's a cessation. When we're first born, the first thing we do is inhale. We spend our years inhaling, exhale, and the last thing we do is exhale, and we don't inhale. It's very mysterious this way. So at first, it was so terrible. I would literally walk back and forth in the living room here screaming out loud, I loved you so much, I loved you so much. I couldn't bear it, really. And then there was a shift a few months later, and I thought, that's not true. It's not that I loved you so much. You're dead and I still love you. It was like a shift inside. And not only do I still love you, that I believe in all our faith walk together, meditating together, that you're loving me in a depth of infinite love I can't comprehend. And that was the beginning of me being deeply at peace here with her. The whole touching place of birth and death and eternity and time. And so that's what it's been like for me. And I have one more wish too, I would add to it. Is another way that I put it this way, is that we tend to give more credit to our shortcomings, like a conditioned state of a shortcoming. St. Paul talks about the thorn in the flesh. He said, I have this thorn in the flesh. He doesn't tell us what it is, but it's like a shortcoming he can't get rid of this way. And so we all have our stumbling place, addictive patterns with, yours, I know mine, everyone has it. But the issue isn't that. The issue is we actually give more credit to our inability to get past the shortcoming than we do to the love that's infinitely in love with us and our inability to get past the shortcoming, which is the gift of tears. See, the gift of tears is being loved without foundations, which is mercy. God is all merciful. And so I would say also that the wish would be, which is God's wish, that each person, his or her own way, would come into this fullness of the generosity of God incarnate as their life. It would also learn to see that their very shortcomings themselves, deeply accepted, are the portal through which we're liberated from the tyranny of shortcomings. Like that. I would put it that way.
When I show people the portrait that we made of you in front of Thomas Merton's Hermitage, what do you want people to know about you?
That's good. Thomas Merton lives in this cloistered monastery, and he felt such a deep draw for solitude, to be alone. And he got permission to live in this hermitage. He was the first Cistercian to be, because it's a community order. The Carthusians are a cloistered order, they're hermits. They live in their own little hermitage. The Camaldoli also. Right? But he was the first Cistercian to be since the Middle Ages. And I used to help him take care of his hermit. I used to go up and bring him firewood and help, because I was planning to stay there. And I wanted to go to Rome and get my ascension in philosophy, and I wanted to be a hermit. And the thing about it is, he was so radical in his childlike integrity of being true to who he thought God was calling him to be. And he just lived it in the simplicity of himself. And he lived it in such a way, he accepted the complexity of himself. He fell in love with his nurse. He fought with the abbot all the time. He just, he was like an infinitely loved broken person who would just shine like a light to me this way. And so that hermitage represents to me his fidelity to the call. So then I think this house, this place that I'm in with Maureen is like a hermitage, really. Like alone with the alone, never less alone than when alone, Plotinus says. So how can our own home be like a sacred space where we learn from God to be quietly surrendered over to the presence of God, sustaining us breath by breath as the beloved in the midst of unresolved things this way. And so the home then becomes, I think we can be deeply at home in the midst of our own home, I think. Yeah.